City Council for Monday, March the 5th. We have two items on our agenda tonight. First one being the Administrative Policy Manual. Mr. Feuerborn.
Thank you, Your Honor, and I will turn it immediately over to Chief Zimmerman.
Thank you, Mr. Feuerborn. I just mentioned if we play our cards right, we could be out of here in about 15 minutes. But, I do want to start by, and I'm going to embarrass Sean a little bit here. Are you ready for this? Mm-hmm. As I mentioned at the last meeting that we discussed this, that a lot of work was done on the Administrative Policy Manual long before I ever got involved in it. I think that I had mentioned former Assistant City Manager Meredith Hauk, an attorney from NPR, and then, and of course, you know, Sean, and they all worked on it a significant amount of time before the City Council saw fit to hire an HR attorney, Carrie Reisdorf, who you all have met, and Carrie became involved in that process when Meredith left, and then I had the opportunity to become involved in the process as well. A significant amount of work had been done on the policy manual already up to that point, including taking out a lot of the procedural parts of the manual, examples of if you do this, this happens, or you know, it's 15 days to do this. And so there were lots and lots of examples and procedural items that had been included in the manual, which made it very voluminous, of course. But the lion's share of the work had already been done by Sean, who is an expert in her field of human resources. And then with the review of the attorneys like Matt Gist and then Carrie Reisdorf ultimately, you know, before I ever got involved in it, coming up now on a year ago. And then Sean and Carrie and I started working together to make sure that we really, you know, polished off the remaining few rough edges to make sure that it captures exactly what, you know, we're hoping to give to new employees that come in. So those, what you see here, and you will see in the next sections as well, are those overarching policies that we want to make sure a new employee sees coming in. So when Sean and I started working on the policy manual together with Carrie, then ultimately it went before the core team, and that included Jonathan. So we've had another set of lawyer eyes that have looked at it as well, and then ultimately the management team. So it has been reviewed and reviewed and reviewed, and we're not saying by any stretch that you know, there might not be something that you see there that there's a question about, but, you know, rather than go through it line by line, as I know several of you hoped I would, we'll just open it up for any questions, because I know you've had it a couple weeks, and these are just the first 4 sections that kind of get us into the meatier sections, which will come later on. So,
anyone have any questions? Mr. Holman.
I addressed this issue back with the previous city manager. The section on how far an employee can live away from the city, I think it's set at 35 miles. I'm curious as to what the justification is for that.
Well, I would love to answer that, and I'm going to turn a little bit of that over to Sean, because that question did come up and has come up a number of times. Yeah, it's 300.5 residency requirements, and I'll let Sean describe a lot of work that she did when that question was raised before, and some surveys that had taken place of other agencies and employee residency requirements. Go ahead, Sean.
Back in 2014, the same issue came up, and I was asked to conduct a survey of other cities, which I did. And many of the cities had the mileage requirement for the safety personnel, either the 35 miles or they needed to be within the city limits within 30 minutes. At that time, a lot of them had stopped requiring other employees to have to be within that 35 miles, except for the city manager. But then it was decided under Mr. Berlin and the former council members that the 35 miles was justified.
And if I may add to that, we've had a lengthy discussion about, does this just apply to public safety employees? And of course, you all know, where I came from. I worked in Kansas City for 33 years, and we had a very strict residency requirement. People got fired if they didn't live inside the city limits of Kansas City. I would argue sometimes that, and part of our discussion about this has been, if you only have that apply to public safety employees like police officers or dispatchers or folks like that, in a true disaster, there might be a whole lot of other people as well, like Public Works or Parks and Recreation, people that would have to come and block streets if we had flooding and things like that. And so I think that as that discussion has morphed over the years, it was, who is considered truly public safety and who might get pressed into service if there was truly a disaster here where we needed folks here and we needed them here in a hurry.
I think that policy's pretty hollow. At 35, we're not going to go out and we're not going to measure where that person's house is at. And basically all it does is keep the honest people honest. Somebody that comes and rats himself out to us and we look at sending him packing, I'm not in favor of that. But my opinion is if you've got a job, you're supposed to be here at 8 or you're supposed to be here at 6 p.m. If you're here on time and your performance is up to snuff and it's not affecting your performance, I don't care where they live if they're taking care of business.
Mr. Kellogg.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Holman, for bringing that up. I made a phone call shortly after we got this, and that is exactly the question that I had for our city manager, Jim Feuerborn. You are correct that we did hash this out back then. And I asked the question, because I thought it was 25 miles. Jim corrected me. He said it was 35 miles. My concern is that when this was exercised and when it came to the council before was because of a specific employee that had a hardship. Personal life happens. Personal life happens to everybody. And he self-reported, and he was just a few miles outside of the 35. And employment was terminated. I thought that was a shame that happened. As I read through here, just before it goes into 300.6, it does say the city council may waive this requirement on an employee-by-employee basis by a three-fourths votes of the entire council, which I think is good. I believe I read in here, and I can't see it right now, that if a person does not, and correct me if I'm wrong, if a person is hired and they live outside of that 35 miles, they have a certain amount of time to move in?
A year.
A year. There's my justification for a case by case. And thank gosh I don't remember the guy's name of our former employee. He was an excellent employee, don't get me wrong, but I'm not going to say his name even if I remembered it. I would think that an exclusion or an exception or some kind of an allowance would be allowed to an employee that hadn't used that at the beginning or at any time, because life happens. Unfortunately, it happens every day. So that's my soapbox there. I would hope that our policy allows for a individual case because they're all different. That's what I got to say. Thank you.
Ms. Abdel-Gawad.
I was just going to share that I remember this conversation too, and one of the things that was brought up when we talked about it before was, do we feel like we're not getting good employees because they don't want to come and live within 35 miles? And what I remember of the conversation was the opinion that it really didn't seem to be affecting. There weren't people who were calling, inquiring about jobs and learning about this and saying, never mind. We don't have people that are getting jobs and then being fired on a regular basis after not being able to move in a year. So I was just going to add that tidbit if that helps.
Anyone else want to address that topic or any others within the policy? Mr. Townsend.
Yes, I had a quick question. Earlier in the manual here, back in paragraph 100.3, the city manager is addressed as being responsible for employees and administrative officers and so on with regards to appointments and such, how does that conflict with, as Councilmember Kellogg brought up regarding the council having 3/4 vote regarding the residency requirement?
Can you get
I'm
a little
sorry.
closer?
How does that, does that conflict with the council having the need to vote when someone's outside the city limits as far as residency?
The residency requirement coming before the council is the exception that makes the rule. I'm responsible to you all for all of the hiring and firing and any personnel issues that go on. It's my responsibility to administer this, with the one exception of I have the responsibility to bring to you all anyone who requests an appeal relative to the distance requirement. That's all. I don't see them as a conflict. I see it as a logical extension. They're both policies that can live in harmony with each other within the manual.
So all other reasons for termination doesn't, for any other employee, doesn't come before the council, at the exception of this one?
That's correct.
Okay.
Mr. Kellogg?
Thank you. I want to ask a question because I'm only asking because of experience. And Chief, or Mayor was chief at the time when it came up. I remember one time we had an employee that appealed a decision of the chief, and it came before the council. And it's really hard to talk about this because it was all closed session. But my feeling is that what Jim just said, we hire the city manager to make these decisions, but yet we, the council, have the ability to override that person. I just remember, and I'm getting really, I'm going to leave it at that. If any of my colleagues or Jonathan want to discuss this later on more in detail, I'd be happy to, but I'm treading very, very close to that line that I should not go over.
Anybody want to address that?
Well, I actually can,
Okay.
sir. The grievance policy that is in the current manual, which has been revised in here, the grievance policy allowed for, in extreme circumstances, a grievance, and it was crazy. City manager had to get the grievance within so many days. City manager had to, it was one of those SOPs that the chief is talking about that is removed with an overarching policy statement that any employee can grieve any circumstance. That, how that works is that what the policy states is what the first level of grievance is going to be, which is they can take a grievance verbally or in writing to the city manager, to the HR director, to a department head. The old policy actually stepped out the number of days that everybody had to do everything and respond, and it ended with ultimately a grievance can be brought before the city council, and it had all kinds of rules and regulations about that as well. That's how that one got to you all.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Chief. You're gonna say something?
The last thing that I was going to say is it's our hope that if everything looks okay in sections 1 through 400, that we would like to bring this before the council a week from tonight in the first read.
And then following that, following up on that, tomorrow or Wednesday, we hope to get you the next two sections so you have 2 weeks to review those as well if you have any questions. And it's kind of one of these step-up processes. As we get deeper and deeper into it, they tend to get weightier and weightier as we go along. So we wanted to be sure we gave you the same amount of time with these and not wait for the Thursday mailing. Very good. We'll have it before you next Monday night.
Okay. And next item on the agenda is very short. I just wanted to report out that Mr. Fearborn, Mr. Tapp, and I have been discussing potential candidates for the TIF Commission. We have 2 openings at the time, and I'm suggesting Mike Wilson, who served on the Charter Commission, and Don Schmidt, who is a resident and is a 40-year-plus agricultural finance and loans in the agribusiness, retired in 2016. He's a member of the Chamber of Commerce, United Way, been on the hospital board. He's a very active member in his other community. He moved here in 2009, and I think would be a good addition. His name's Don Schmidt, if I didn't say that. And those are the 2 I'd be recommending. Anybody has any questions about that? Because we are hopefully in the next, soon, the TIF Commission may be getting busy. So we need to make these appointments as soon as possible and get them acclimated to what the TIF Commission does and rock and roll from there. Sure, go ahead.
For those of you who are not aware, the chairman of the TIF Commission, Mr. Mike Nefko, fell down off of a ladder and suffered a significant head injury. He, I believe, may have just come home, but this was, gosh, 2 months ago now, and he's been in a rehab unit since then, so could be an issue for the TIF Commission, but there is an assistant chair. Mr. Nefko actually represents the other taxing districts by virtue of his role on the Fire District Board. And so the other 3 taxing districts get together and actually vote who's going to be representing them. Doesn't have anything to do with our appointments here. It would be up to them to make a decision on what to do.
Anybody have anything else? You have anything else?
Conclude staff reports.
Okay. If nobody has anything else, then we're adjourned. Thank you.